Hello? Hello. Hello, Internet, and welcome to another highly viewed, highly beloved Wednesday serial. That's a lie. You can see the numbers. Yeah. So, this one, I'm gonna twist a little. I want to talk about the fall of X, and I don't think it's the plot. Ha. Uh, so first, I kind of want to get through some of the ribble and rabble, and then talk about there was a few issues in particular that got me thinking, and so I want to talk about that. But first, there was the Excellent Five playing with Alrad's and Milligan's thing. I'm kind of hoping this wraps up their whole bit. This isn't as strong as Ecstatics, as even as strong as the last mini they did with these during the Krakoan era. This is just losing its luster because the whole X Force Ecstatics thing was based in this kind of reality TV moment that happened decades ago and was kind of in a different zeitgeist. The character zeitgeist. The whole idea of a zeitgeist now is so lost because everything has become so mediated that things move faster and faster. But in a lot of ways, it's more similar to what it was years ago than the way things used to move before because it's so tied to these different corporate entities and these different movements and recycling off of things we'd seen before as opposed to originality, and just the whole idea of what they're playing with just doesn't work. It was a comic book that worked well in the heyday of the millennial experience, if you will, and now that we're in a new generation, it just doesn't play. So I don't know. I don't think it's a fruitless comic, but I just don't think I don't think that idea is worth exploring anymore. I think if they want to do something similar, it's time for a truly fresh take. Um, New Mutants Lethal Legion is kind of a stock standard superhero comic. Nothing really stand out, but it's fine. It's good. It was there if you like the characters that they're playing with. Probably worth it, whatever. X-23 was a harken to the past to play with the idea of Laura coming up, but inserting her to the Marvel crime world. So, of course, you have to have Kingpin, which is actually a weird contrast to the fact that Kingpin is now currently on Krakoa and was just kind of a weird moment. So, I don't know. Um, then, then there were two of these older ones that were this breath of fresh air amongst this kind of more modern X thing going on. Uh, the Nassetti Storm issue, this one really took me. I've been kind of more middling and whatnot, but kind of coming to it uh, and kind of remembering with Nassetti Comics is unlike a lot of other authors, she doesn't try to hit everything out the gate. It's not that it's a weak start, it's that she's not putting all her eggs on issue one, which is in a weird way so common now that I'm so used to it that I didn't really. This had a bit more build, a bit more play, and we were playing on themes and ideas that reached back a couple issues, but they were strong enough connections that it's like, oh, right. And it played in a way that it said in one sentence enough to truly connect the ideas and evoke everything in a way that just a lot of writers now aren't used to. They're so used to writing for whatever it is now, as opposed to these monthly installments where Claremont and Sunny, that era, really had to hit like any comic could be anyone's first, right? So there are these just subtle ways that they just drop information in that actually really carries issue to issue a lot more strongly, and in a way that if you read these all back to back would feel somewhat natural because they're talking through things and they're not just assuming they're on the same page when they start a new conversation, I guess. So it really worked. But as much as this is focusing on Storm and kind of her transformation to her more punk mohawk look and whatnot, that's kind of what this centers around. Um, this really is just a book of the X-Men in that moment, in that weird moment where it was none of the old X-Men and it was all this new batch, and Xavier was there, but Xavier was about to take off, and Storm didn't know where she was, and she was the de facto leader because the last de facto leader had already left. It was a weird time in the grander X mythology now, looking back on it. That was actually relatively long, but in the history of X-Men and the way I understood it growing up through the cartoon and whatnot, this kind of weird moment at the mansion and all these new characters that had kind of just come in, but were the only X-Men we had, while the other ones were off being the champions or whatever, or X Factor, really was a strong thing that made the X-Men and not just kind of the original five, and really allowed the breadth of everything to grow. So I don't know. I really enjoyed it. I really like the interactions. I like Kitty being a teen again. And I like the little fruits they get into and the soap drama. It just everything was here because it's a tight crew. It's a tight book. Uh, Yeah. And then I bet a lot of you probably saw this and maybe had some reservations as I did, but this Days of Future Past, Doomsday, going back and building it up. It doesn't feel so much like a straight retelling of Days of Future Past, but is fleshing out this Doomsday scenario a lot. And it did so much that I loved in place of the X-Men in Marvel being in here. You see Steve Rogers on talk shows being interviewed as he speaks for the mutant experience, just kind of necessarily in passing, but it's the topic of the day, right? You see a bunch of a crowd of mutant haters take on Spider-Man and beat the crud out of him because they think he's a mutant, because why wouldn't they? And you see these other characters kind of itching and pushing at the X-Men because of the X-Men and the bigotry attached to them being mutants. It's making their lives harder as people presume that they are mutants as well. And that leads to this Days of Future Past thing, which plays out the metaphor, plays it across Marvel, and is really interesting. Now, there's a lot of really weird, loose, and quick moments that kind of string together to build to it. And I'm curious to see where issue 2 goes because they're already kind of past it. But it was so many little things that I've always thought should be the way Marvel works. Also, notably, there are some humans that aren't just wild bigots. It painted a picture of a world, not just of these set groups per corporate understanding and divided lines. And if you are a person, you are this. It allowed characters to be characters with just a few lines because, just because you're a human, you could be a reporter and you understand bigotry is wrong, maybe. Um, so there was a lot of that, and it was a very appreciated first issue. Very excited to see where it goes, but I, I think it's worth picking up. But there is a kind of caveat there in that this issue is $5. Yikes. Next, I want to run through some of the more Krakoan era X books that I read. Just have less to say because I've picked out three that I think I want to focus on and talk about the fall of X, but we'll get there. So, the first here is X Force 42, The Ghost Centurions Part 3, in which this X Force within this issue goes to a future that the Beast has created, saves the day, and pulls back. Ultimately, the reason they're doing this is to absolve Quentin Quire of this future, pull him back, and then have something to go and deal with the Beast in their day, I guess. But in this future, Beast kept Deadpool as kind of this jester character. Deadpool. Oh, what a play. And they do all of this in very short order. It is a it is the tightest dystopian future X book ever. Um, it's it's kind of cool because I was kind of thinking, especially after having read that just Days of Future Past thing, like, here we go again, another X dystopian future. What makes it different from that one, from Bishops, from Cables, from. But this really played forward and was kind of a fun play, just taking the fun parts of a dystopia, not making anything more than what it needed to be. So there was that. Then there was X-Men Red, which was dealing with the Akraki characters on Mars. I believe trying to wrap up part of that before the status quo change. But what really hit me reading this book is there's supposed to be all these galactic consequences, and so much of even other books in this era where there's all these big things happening. But they had tried to make X-Men more of a political thriller in some ways with their faux government and whatnot. Um, Faux, people might take it, it's fiction, it's faux, whatever. Uh, so that can play, but one of the hallmarks of a good political thriller is people making decisions, at a boardroom table or whatever it is, with the heated conversation, all your Dutch angles on at a table or the Oval Office or whatever it is. And then you move to where there's real world consequences, or we go to a different setting and we see this ideal put forward where the friction of the real world comes into against policy, uh, in one form or another. I mean, this even happened in the West Wing, or any Aaron Sorkin thing, or any, you know, um, general political thrill. I mean, that's just part of the method mode. It's tried and true. And I mean, it's such a basic, simple part of the concept that's important. And with X-Men, it seems really easy to do, right? They have this idea of what they're going to do with mutants. Then you go at least out to the island and then see maybe the populace doesn't respond as much. They didn't do a lot of that. And with this book, I really realized they're there on Mars, except the table is just in the middle of a field, and there's just these people arguing about these galactic consequences. They're just some people that I don't even remember or care about really, sitting at a table in the middle of nowhere, just blathering at each other. This is everything people complained about with Star Trek being boring, which I don't agree with generally, but this is the worst ideas of that. This is the worst ideas of policy brought forward. It's a lot of emoting, but no rules in place to have to wind around to move forward. There's no intrigue, there's no setting. It's just people arguing at a table. What are we doing? Uh, so then we move to the Sinister Four, um, which is a Marvel evoked name, obviously, to actually have what's actually a really interesting issue. So if you don't know the main backstory here is that Mr. Sinister was a bad man back in the before times, who kind of made himself into a mutant through genetic understanding, but also through apocalypse. But when he was but a man, he had a wife, he had a child, things ended horribly, and then he decided to strip himself of all things good and become Mr. Sinister. Now his human side has been brought forward through sci-fi shenanigans, and we have this other character and his wife reincarnate, but they're both twisted and evil now too. But we get to play out the drama between these characters that's been kind of sitting there. And this is a lot of two characters talking at a table, much like the last issue, but it's a dining room table, and it's about their relationship. And they both have wants and needs that are being expressed or not expressed very delicately and brought forward. It's a story because there's some push and pull there. And there's other characters that fold in, which is where we get the four. It ends up not being all that important, but it's an interesting little moment of drama based on the history cooked in with Sinister and who he was before and everything that's happened throughout the Krakoan era, especially past the sins of Sinister. And this is kind of not putting a bow on it, but allowing us to bring forth a lot of what needed to happen and allowing two characters who needed to talk, Dr. Stasis and Ruby, Miss whatever, and just get that done with and move on. This was a much needed issue and was compelling just for the character drama. And that's a great thing, I think, to do with a one shot in the midst of this whole deal. Um, Rogue and Gambit is number five. It's there. It wraps up. Um, this was a fun, the road trip kind of comic thing, building out these two characters, having some fun with it, not getting too serious with everything going on. Yeah, it was fun. And then we have the end, at least of it's the end of the Wolverine in this era, which wraps up the whole him versus Beast thing without too many surprises. But very importantly, it also sets up this Wolverine being off the island for the events to come following the beginning of the fall of X. So it's putting Wolverine on the board, as it were. So through rather silly one little bit at the end where he just says, I'm done with Krakoa for now. I'm off into the world and burn, which like it makes sense. Like it's earned because he just dealt with all the stuff with Beast and having done all this for Krakoa that he had kind of misgivings about because he knows to stay sharp in the world that was built up throughout this whole run. Um, and so he leaves, but it's just in the nick of time to put him in place for an event, and that is kind of what makes it feel cheap, which is unfortunate because it's a metatextual layering over something that otherwise could have been good. I think if there's even just one issue to play it out where he just did some Wolverining in the world, like had been done a million times before. Just one issue of a one shot, of him just being Wolverine would have given it the breath it needed to not feel cheap and corporate. That's all. I want to talk about this end of Immortal X-Men, and I'm going to flip through it a bit while talking through it because this is an issue and it's Gillen writing, and there's a lot of ideas presented here that I think show the watering down of what could have been because they didn't know where they were going and then they decided to wrap it up when they had a lot of strings to pull that they just never did. Uh, so it starts off with some preamble about the quiet cancel and where they are, but the idea is the leaves, they're wilting, they're this, they're that. It's fall. It's fall of the X-Men, but it's autumn. Oh boy, the metaphors. Uh, there's all this talk of kind of how the medicines that they gave out to the world aren't working like they should be. What's going on there? We find out. I'm just gonna spoilers all around from other books, whatever, because you have to connect it. And that's part of the problem with that's been throughout this whole era is if you're not reading a lot of, especially the main books, other things just don't connect or make sense. The reason the medicines aren't working, we find out, is because Dr. Stasis, the not Sinister, um, poison stuff when he was around last year at the gala. Yahoo! So, yada yada. And so, because of that, the finances are going, and Emma's saying, like, well, we can't run a nation without money. But They established at the beginning that they can. They cannot now, having followed where this went, they cannot do all the things that they want to do internationally without money. But effectively, they'd be able to keep their citizens sheltered, fed, clothed, um, with entertainment, with transportation, with access to the greater world in one way or another. But if they want to keep growing, expanding, and influencing and running the programs that they're doing internationally, they might have to find other streams of revenue and or kind of put it on the citizens, or at least many of the citizens, to do work. I don't know. It's just it, it's so like this ideal of like what their paradise is supposed to be is bore into their head, and the idea of change or adaptation is just so beyond their scope of reality. It's so unrealistic to think that they're going to give up everything because they don't have a revenue source, because the medicine isn't working like it's supposed to. But also, the medicine isn't working like they're supposed to, but it was poisoned. But like, they have sci fi nonsense. Did no one think to like check it? I they don't go to that level of detail of process, but it's kind of maddening to think the processes that we go through with like the FDA and checks and the things that come with a society that are kind of the grievances that have to happen because we live in a society, um, that none of that thought or idea or procedure or governance is going into a story about government. It's really frustrating. So, okay, so we continue. There's that. I must stop. That's boring now, says Professor Xavier. Um, Yada, yada, yada. And then they start talking about Celine and how Celine's broken some of the laws because she's killed some people, which they kind of all know and kind of agreed to, and they put her on the council. If you don't know, Celine's like a witch who's bad. Uh, okay. And there's some things that she's pointing to that like only Sinister can answer because only he knew's there, and um, they're like, pull him out of the pit and we'll get answers. And no, let's not do that. Which, okay. Um, so they kind of move through some of that and deal with the fact that Celine's a bad girl. And then they get into a bit of a fight because Celine's a bad girl. And they talk about the morality of what they've done, putting people in the pit, putting Sinister in the pit, putting Sabretooth in the pit, whatnot. This ultimately ends up kind of being foreshadowing, but not really, because it's not actually foreshadowing, because that's all based on morality and why they're doing things and why they chose to put people in the pit. Um, so they're kind of talking about like how there's this seedy underbelly and what they did was wrong because they put people in a prison. Putting people in prison is wrong, right? Well, I took issue with this because they made a big morality play about putting Sabretooth in some sort of prison. And to be fair, Sabretooth's been effectively different characters throughout the history of Marvel. Um, starting off as an Iron Fist villain. And for a while, I mean, he was just kind of like an arch villain. They built him to be Wolverine's father, and then they rejected that. They made him Wolverine's arch enemy by killing someone who he knew on his birthday. Actually, that was still when he was his father. But they made him more and more arch to the point where he wasn't just like a killer and a vicious fighter, but like a maddened serial killer who delighted in harming people exclusively. It was like so insanely kind of evil, like crime podcast level of like, this is a villain, um evil incarnate, basically. Like the kind of person where it's like, yeah, you put them in a prison because if you let them run loose, they'll just kill everyone, and that's bad by any any measure of morality. But what you're doing to him is wrong because you're limiting his freedoms. Well, he's a psycho murderer. It's not someone who has murdered for reasons. It's someone who murders implicitly because that's who they are deep down. It's you kind of see what I'm saying here. It's not even like talking about like 99% of murders and people are doing stuff for passion, political, for reasons, versus someone who's just a serial killer. um so I don't know. It's weird for them to kind of equivocate on that. Also, they talk about Sabretooth, but they don't talk about any of the Exile characters because they're not name brand TM, properties that they bring up for shorthand in this issue. So they go through that, and then there's this little break, and Cypher talks to Xavier on a cliffside because it's more dramatic that way while Xavier's popping a squat. And they have this talk about how they've been doing bad things, and Krakoa takes in what they're doing, and so everything's wilting because they're bad now. The badness is affecting the island because they're bad because they've done some bad things, like things they've done effectively in the name of survival. Or I guess the weird thing is they don't really bring in Xavier's like original sin of the island of keeping like a couple like precog characters away from it because they're fated to fail against Orcus, except it's supposed to be a couple a few years later from this point. um and so they just they've been bad. I don't know. They've been bad because of some of the stuff they're talking about here. And so Cypher's like, we have to do it. We have to disband the Quiet Council. And if they breathe this sigh of relief because it's like, oh, the secrets are over. We're going to do something okay. And so it's absolving these characters of the supposed sins of what they've done recently. And then something goes wild. And then Krakoa absorbs Cypher and puts him in the pit. We don't really see what happens, we just know he's absorbed. I can tell you why, because I need a few hangers on for the Fall of X story. But it just ends with the mistakes that we made. Oh, just the one mistake. Wow. And it's like, oh, okay, so the Quiet Council is sad. But also, while they're doing all this, Colossus is there but silent, but he's stuck in a literally, as per the text written, stuck in a Russian novel. So he doesn't have control over himself, but he's making these power plays throughout the government, which is weird. So I think that issue really points to a lot of problems because A, the whole governance idea, what they're doing, and then we've been bad, so the island's bad. It just doesn't make sense. It's like they're so focused on things that didn't go well, they're not doing anything to course correct. And then also they're going to shut down the Quiet Council, which is the governing body of the island, with no plans of how to replace it or to move forward. It's effectively them admitting like failure, but it doesn't make sense from their perspective. And also, how they're going about it doesn't make sense from their perspective. It is a written to this Marvel event. It is meta textual in sense only. It does not make sense within the context of the characters because they don't know what's going to be happening. I don't know what the time scaling is here, but later. um, they have no plans to move forward, which is maddening. Um, it's just so poorly written, so poorly thought out. You think an editor would think to add something and to remove some of the pages of this fight over Celine's a bad person. Oh my god, they knew that. They quibbled about that when they brought her on, but did for the reasons they did then. And they're not bringing that up now. They're just fighting now to have punchy pages on the X-Men comic when it's really unnecessary. So, anyways, we get to X-Men 24. They're supposed to be on holiday, but they don't. We have this bit with young Cable going in to do something with Orchis, and he gets just fucking murdered. And so then the X-Men are going to, places. Da, 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 da. Sorry. Um, they're going on vacation. We have this bit with Destiny talking about how things are coming down soon, but she speaks so cryptically no one can understand her, like Rogue. And it's like, well, great. What good is having a? This was the whole thing. Xavier didn't want her there to tell people about the doom coming because that would make people not agree to the plan. But A, they had already agreed to the plan. She's on the board. She's trying to talk to people and then warn them why. Because if she feels like it's coming, it's inevitable. Maybe it's more like get off the island. But she doesn't say anything like that. She speaks in fortune teller, fortune cookie card nonsense. People are like, I don't. We think something bad is going to happen. When, how, why, anything of use? No? Go sit in your corner, crazy lady. Like, wait. Again, it's. There was clearly an idea when Hickman came on with starting all this, and then they have echoes of it, but they don't know how to thread the needle. They don't understand how to tell a story. They don't understand how to build character, so we get none of it. And we just end with this hodgepodge of superhero punchy nonsense, but none of the other side of it that makes it mean anything. So they're on Game World, and some monsters flail out. And then there's this moment, I just want to point to it, where like just one page of Punchy Punch started, and we get, well, I can't figure out angles. We get Forge sitting at a table, and right here, he's talking to the bartender. The bartender's like, "Do you want to help them? Shouldn't you be doing stuff?" I'm supposed to be able to control machines, but a machine humbled me recently. This happened in a recent issue. He almost died because the machine, he thought something was going, then it one upped him because they planned for Forge to do a thing and had a fail safe that would happen after he thought he did the thing. Da, 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 da. Anyways, um, so he's like, I'm sitting back. I invented, and it's this whole thing. It's like, I get that they want to show that Forge is thinking differently now and not engaging in battle. But he says, I'm easing into it and I make things. I was recently humbled. And he says the words recency bias. And he's talking about he's talking about it in this way that doesn't sound like Forge. And I've read Forge through, his first appearances, life, death, all that. He's a character with a certain swagger and mode, and he doesn't talk like a freaking nerd. He talks like an inventor, like an engineer, like someone with purpose and thought and a bit of swagger. And effectively, he's not quite Tony Stark. And they're not doing any of that here. And they're trying to do something, but also what's more telling to me, and this points to a lot of the problems of the characterization. They don't write characters in the moment, and they don't write about anything that makes sense. And so, because when the characters don't react in a way that fits, it just doesn't. The entire artifice and the entire everything falls apart. So they have this bartender going, shouldn't you be helping your friends fight the giant monster who's literally right there? Like some rubble could be hitting this guy in the head at any second. This bartender's just doing his thing. And Forge is having a little chat with him. It's like, why is that bartender not running? It doesn't make sense. And what they're trying to show is that Forge is more reflective now. He's not rushing into things. He's slower to react because he wants to analyze and do the situation. This is where his strength is as he feels it now. And he's changed how he's done. He's gun shy, basically. That's what they're trying to show. The thing is, they could have shown this far better if the other characters were rushing in and Forge was standing back. And he had maybe a moment of reflection or even was just standing back. And you get this sense of like analytics and we get some internal monologue of him going through it. I'm like, aha. And they could even make it a bit of a strength. Like he stands back and he says, got it. And goes in and makes some sort of precise movement that changes the tide of the battle so that they could win. Something more subtle, but they could play it with some of this dialogue that he's just barking at a bartender that shouldn't be there and just make an internal monologue. Part of the problem is Marvel doesn't do thought balloons anymore. Thought balloons are an important tool in the comic book tool set, and rejecting one of the most important tools wholesale means we get this, I guess. This doesn't even need to happen still, but it's just maddening. So there's punchy punch fights with giant lizard people, whatever, yada yada yada. They go, and then there's this big scene between Jean Grey and Cyclops that pissed me off. In it, in this star-studded moment that's all pink and blue and whatever, because space is beautiful and not an infinite void that will kill you. She's talking about how Scott should be proud of the treehouse. It's something he helped build and did all this. But she's like, but I helped terraform a planet and you never visited. He's like, I did maybe that one time, which again is not Cyclops. Cyclops is not a guy who wavers and wanders and does this kind of like passive sort of thing. That's never been him. Never, since Stan Lee wrote him, since Claremont wrote him at like multiple iterations, since Louise Simonson wrote him, since no one has ever written Cyclops like this. But we get this now. And then he says basically, no, this is, they could have just skipped 2 panels that are wasted space, that they could have done anything else with the comic with, maybe give another character a beat. Basically, Scott says, if we give the humans a reason to think the mutants don't belong on Earth, they will take it. It's a creation, a well intended one to solve some short term problems with the integrated Leocraki, but I worry it's an invitation to exile. Oh, really? You're worried about just abandoning a lived part of something as a motion to exile against the entire mission of what the X-Men were founded on, of integrating with mutants to a peaceful harmony, which is something Xavier talked about in one of the comics a while ago. Actually, I think it was that X-Men I was just pointing to, like in pointing out that this entire thing has been against his dream. It was a compromise to make things work. Yay. Okay. And here's Cyclops talking about it kind of from the other end because he's saying, oh, going to Mars would be an invitation to exile. Like the whole freaking Krakoa thing was to the rest of the world. Durdoy, but they're not going to talk about that here because I don't think they realize how stupid what they just said was. I don't think they realize they just admitted that this whole era was stupid for the obvious reason a lot of people have been screaming about since it began and pointing out that it's against the X-Men's mission since it began. They basically just say it, but they're too stupid to connect the dots. It's frustrating. And again, I point to the potential of what could be here versus not because we don't have writers competent enough to bring some of these themes forward or talk about it in any meaningful way. Now, I should point here that the treehouse is in New York. They didn't completely give up on all that, but they kind of did at the same time because it's this little treehouse. Like a bunch of little kids playing in fucking Central Park. Me. As opposed to any establishment, any real thing. And again, the gates. I know what they're trying to get to with the gates, but it's not Star Trek. The gates that they had meant that they didn't actually have to exist anywhere, just that they could be anywhere, which could have allowed for a lot of great stories to talk about things like human trafficking or the drug trade or how international commerce leads to conflict or any of these globalist themes that could have been really interesting to talk about the intersectionality with racism, sexism, or any kind of bigotry, or how those bigotries intertwine together, and not just talk about what they've been banging on about, which is like, we need to live nice. People are mean to us. Yeah, no shit. But you kind of earned it in this whole thing. So so we just kind of move on from that, and then we get some place setting for what's a coming. But again, the main points they're just missing. So that brings us to X-Men: The Hellfire Gala, Super Special Edition. And it starts off, fuck me. It starts off with integrating Kamala Khan into mutants and the X-Men, and they're setting up for her to have yet another superpower on top of her inhuman superpower because she's an inhuman and a mutant. Okay, blah blah blah. I'm almost appreciate the restraint that they had to not say something like Xavier was even able to pick up on Norman Osborn's psychic waves of how distraught he was when you were killed. Because fucking why not at this point? This whole thing's been an entire cluster from Amazing Spider-Man to this. It's a nightmare. Then we have some of the gala. Oh, look at the mutants, and they try to show them happy. They show Cyclops running off because there's an emergency. Then there's an Avengers emergency. And you're like, what's going on? And you kind of realize, like, oh, there's these characters talking about a few things. What they're doing is setting up some characters leaving because of what ultimately the plot is. The elect there would have been new X-Men team, which sounds abysmal. There's no way they would have actually done this. There's no star to sync on. Talon, whoever that is. Sync, Prodigy, Cannonball, Frenzy, Dazzler, Jubilee, and the Juggernaut. Okay, no, that would have been terrible. But then, like, literally the next page, Orcus drops in, they fight, they do this whole rigmarole with only two mutants really stopping. Well, Juggernaut and Jean Grey being the only one to really put up a fight. And Iceman. Except Iceman gets melted because they shoot him with something designed to take out Iceman, obviously. And then yada yada, they fight. And then Jean Grey goes down, and then Moira has a whole thing like, I hate you, Xavier, I hate you. Like, this isn't a character anymore. This is just, they needed a villain, I guess. But the whole pulling away of Moira from what they did with Inferno doesn't play through here. Because this isn't the same character. The motivations are there. She's just evil now. Again, they're not willing to admit that anyone who is in Orcus or anywhere else against the X-Men might actually have a motivation that actually makes a sense or actually has a point after they claim dominion of the solar system or effectively have, trained soldiers. I mean, don't forget, Cyclops was a child soldier, depicted as such, even in the Stan Lee run. The rest of them are basically trained soldiers. They have a whole bunch of seasoned fighters, infiltrators, murderers all over this island with easy access to any nation, almost any point globally, with no recourse on the other end. Yeah, some people are nervous with good reason. What if something even goes slightly awry? What if, I mean, early on, Sabretooth could have just wandered into, like, the Middle East, done a genocide. Oops. I don't know. Whatever. So this moves forward, and then Xavier surrenders because there's no other way to deal with, like, there's like 5 villains here, and there's an entire nation of people with superpowers that can fight, but they can't do anything about it. Heaven forbid they fight 5 people. Okay, sure. Or Xavier could go into their minds and, like, wipe them, which is against his ethics, but as opposed to the compromisation of a nation, whatnot, and letting all the people he cares about be killed by, again, these arch villains, he can't compromise his morals to save the life of everyone here. Okay, whatever. So he implants something in them, and they say R, ES. It's resist, but it's R and then ES and the rest. Yada yada. They're saying like a thing because he's putting them under spell, and they all go through the gates. The gates were supposedly going to Mars, but they revealed that they kind of went supposedly nowhere. I have a feeling that's not quite the case, obviously, right? They didn't just murder everyone. Cyclops was taken out at the treehouse when he ran off all alone because it was a trap. Because we all know Cyclops, master strategist, who is down to like the Morrison Batman level throughout this run, just couldn't predict someone calling during an important time to ambush him to take them out. Also, when he ran off on his own, they didn't touch on the whole Captain Krakoa thing they're building up with, so I guess that's just kind of over. Um, yeah, there's a lot of things that just kind of were being built up to that are just they just dropped those threads. Da, 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 da. Wolverine was there, even though he's supposed to be off the island. Hmm. Mystique has a freak out and drops off the side of a cliff, and then we just end up with all of them going nuts, and then Rogue's supposed to go avenge them, and then we get ads. There's going to be a Miss Marvel, the New Mutant series. Oh boy. They talk about 3 issues of it. And she's an X-Man now. Okay, they're really pushing that. And then there's all this nonsense. Like, there's just a handful of characters from the X-Men that are out there into the world, and that's it. That's how this goes. Is they're having a party, some people crash it, and then everybody dies. No political consequences, no rebuttal for the fact that they were kind of twisting the knife around each other and trying to be above human ideals while just sniping and basically being some sort of like English court, vibing around each other for power and manipulation. There's no comeuppance for the fact that they could have militarized and attacked the world. No comeuppance for the fact that they set out a medicine that they didn't regulate and poisoned a whole bunch of people. Nothing to deal with the fact that really their entire workforce for the output of the economy that supposedly failed was one guy pushing himself in the form of multiple man that ultimately didn't quite work out. Maybe there's a mental exhaustion and like labor idea to be talked about there. Nothing to talk about the need of unionization and the idea of how roles in this society might pit people against each other who would otherwise like each other, because just the nature of these kinds of systems and programs create conflict. There's all this potential that they could have done with these characters that we know from other situations being brought into a new context and then moving it forward before we blow it up. And they just didn't do any of that. And what kills me is you could see Hickman starting to claw at most of those ideas and then not being able to carry it forward because they wanted to spend more time in the happy fun place instead of talking about anything that might actually matter, might actually make an impact, might actually make these stories relevant past their date of publication because they're just the new thing on the stands. It's the death of substance. And it sucks because when you go back and read Claremont, you go back and read a lot of the earlier X-Men, even the 90s stuff, there was at least something trying to be said in between Magneto becoming a baby or whatever the weird villain of the week was. There was lots of stories of social consequence, but they were smaller and tend to be more episodic. And apparently they don't have the bandwidth to tell anything larger, but they keep wanting to be more epic. Blow it up. Blow it all up. Get smaller. Have settings. Have meaning. That's what I have to say here. So keep reading and find something of substance.